I've been using this trusty old Dewalt angle grinder for a couple of years now. It's been spinning slower and slower, and it's been becoming noisier and noisier. One day when I was using the grinder, it shut itself off and stopped like it had a brake on it. I could turn it by hand, but only just. It was very stiff. Since I really needed a grinder, I went ahead and bought a cheapy Harbor Freight one, which has been doing well enough, but I'd like to fix the Dewalt one. So once I found some time to do so, I took the grinder apart. It's a really simple design. It's really just the clamshell, the motor, some gears, and a switch. I went ahead and removed the motor and removed the rotor from the housing, and it was immediately obvious which one was bad. It was the rear rotor support bearing. So I went ahead and removed that bearing. I got a little creative and was able to use a 2-jaw puller and a bolt to remove the bearing from the shaft. Once it was off, I was able to see that the cage had exploded in the bearing and completely locked it up. The movement I was able to get was because the outer race of the bearing was spinning inside of the clamshell. Luckily, the bearing is a 608, which is a very common standard bearing size. So I hit eBay, and soon enough, I had the new part. So this bearing's a little funny. It's a 608Z, which is a shield on one side, and a 608RS on the other side, which is a seal. The 608's a super common size, but that combination isn't quite as easy to find. I found some, but they were a bit expensive, so I ended up just saying screw it, and I went ahead and got a dual shielded bearing. I went for one made by SKF, so at least it should be a quality part. A dual sealed would be better at keeping out debris and stuff, but a dual shielded has less friction and does a decent job at keeping out particles. And since the old one already had a shield on one side anyway, I don't feel too bad about using a double shielded, and worst case, this bearing goes out eventually too. At least it was just a couple of dollars. So now we'll go ahead and install the new bearing on the rear of the motor shaft. I'd put the clamshell back together to make sure I didn't lose any pieces in the meantime. So we'll pull the clamshell back apart and take the rotor back out. With the rotor removed, it was easy enough to put it in the vise and simply use that clamping force to install the bearing. With the bearing flush to the shaft, the fitment in the clamshell was a little bit tight, so I used a washer to install the bearing a little past flush. With that done, I removed the gritty old grease and used some new grease, which is just wheel bearing grease, which should be good enough for this purpose, and put everything back together. Once the two halves of the clamshell were back together and everything lined up, I retightened all the screws. And the next thing to do was simply to test the grinder. So there we go, the grinder has come back to life. So of course, let's give it a few quick tests. So, happily for me, this grinder is back in working order. Everything spins very freely, and it keeps spinning for a long time after you shut it off, which it was not doing towards the end of that bearing's life. So at the end of the day, yeah, you'd be better off getting a new grinder instead of using a still kind of crusty old one. But for a little over $3, I was able to revitalize this one at least a little bit so that I can keep using it. And when you can get a grinder like this Harbor Freight one for $10, it's worth weighing the value of saving an old tool versus just getting a new one. Now that being said, this new Harbor Freight grinder has bearings in it that sound just about as bad as this bearing did before it failed. So you do get what you pay for. But I'm still happy to have been able to fix this grinder so I can get back to using it.